Okay, I think we're online here. I think I did what I'm supposed to do. Oh, good. Thank you. A little bit of just waiting for everybody to get online. I've cracked a beer. Not actually. I've cracked something. This is exciting. People have started to chat. I always give a few minutes, Jewish time. Always give a few minutes, let people log on. So saying, well, you see the shirt I've got on for today. I know I'm not a Detroit Tigers fan, but I decided to put on my my Twins baseball jersey here. A root beer? No. So I want to say hello to Stephen and Lewis and Max and Bonnie and Claire and the Judge RLP. I know who you are. Others may. Good to have you. It's exciting. How do I... And Deb is there too. Deb just... Lauren and Louise are there. I knew I was waiting to see when my fanboy, as he called himself to me in an email, Lauren Rabbi, would log on, because I'll give you the background of this. I was going to do this presentation at Leibl this year, which I think was on Feb 29th, right? We had a Feb 29th. Anything pre-pandemic feels like, how long ago does that feel, right? It was like 2 weeks before the lockdown. And the morning of Leibl, I woke up in the middle of the night and I was just feeling so awful. Not coronavirus, COVID related, but I don't think. But I was just feeling so awful, and I just couldn't do it. So I was frantically emailing people I knew on the committees. I'm not going to show up. I can't do it. I'm sick. I can't stand in front of a room for an hour. It's going to be terrible. And then I got a few messages that day from a few people who were, I don't want to say they were devastated, because I'm laughing that the idea that missing a talk by me on a famous Jewish baseball player would be devastating. It seems comical to me. There's so many more things in life that are truly devastating. But a lot of people were expressing, a few people had emailed me, I can't believe you didn't show up. I was so looking forward to this. So it's almost 4 months later. It's almost 4 months later, and it's almost 4 months later, and here we go. So I've been able to do it. I workshopped this presentation with a smaller group to see if it would work in this online format, and it did. And I'm happy to have all of you logged on here for today's talk, entitled Hank Greenberg, the Forgotten Jewish Superstar. I think that's what we called it. So Cleveland is watching. Oh my, the entire city of Cleveland. Love Cleveland. Haven't been to Cleveland since 2008. Great Lakes Science Center, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is amazing. It's a must-see, one of the top museums I've ever been to. So Rochelle Littman from Cleveland, great to have you. And his sibling, who looks a lot like my old friend Terry Kushner, is here. And so is Shelly Chachanoff and Rena Elbaz. Okay, so nice to have all of you online. Can you hear me okay? I had my headphones plugged in there, so maybe it was a little muffled, but I've unplugged them. I just realized that. Can someone message in the chat if you can hear okay, and if you can see okay, and then we will get started. And Thelma, hi Thelma. Yes, I can hear you. Great. You can hear me, you can see me. I've got my Twins jersey on for baseball. So welcome everybody. If you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook, you can chat, and I will keep checking the chat as we get to kind of little stops along the way. Sharon Rabbi Allentuck is here. Great to see you. I'm loud and clear. Okay, great. Thank you, Claire. Okay, can hear you and see. Okay, good, perfect. Thank you. So if you're watching on YouTube or if you're watching on Facebook, feel free to chat right away if you've got any questions. I am going to share my screen in a second because I put together a little PowerPoint here to guide us through. So you won't see me for all of this. So sorry, you're not going to get 53 more minutes of just me. But you are going to see the PowerPoint. But I will kind of flip back and forth between being able to see your chat, being able to see everything going on. and so please keep chatting, and we'll check in there. And no, I knew Rochelle. I know your husband is a big Cleveland fan. There is a Hank Greenberg Cleveland connection that will come up in today's presentation. So why don't we see if I can share my screen here? I've shared my screen, and here we go, and then should be good. All right. Here we are. Hank Greenberg, the first Jewish superstar. Thank you to everyone again for being here. This is, it's really fun when I get to do something like this for work because this is a real passion of mine and a true love. You know, sports and baseball in particular, and baseball history are things that I've been just soaking up since I was, I think, old enough to read and old enough to listen to the radio and old enough to watch TV. And the story of putting this together, this Hank Greenberg talk, kind of came out of wanting to correct an injustice. So this fellow here, you can see on the screen, is not Hank Greenberg. It's interesting, right? That the very first slide in our Hank Greenberg presentation after the title, you'd think would be a picture of Hank Greenberg. But no, this is a picture of Sandy Koufax. And this is the injustice that I am setting out to correct today, as well as have a little bit of fun. Let me explain. Growing up, I grew up in a family. I wouldn't describe myself as having come from an athletic family, but definitely a family who loved sports. My mom is one of four, and she has two younger brothers. One has since passed away, but she has two younger brothers who were both very athletic. And my grandfather, my Zeta Harold, who grew up in rural Saskatchewan on farms, he was very athletic. He was actually a very good athlete. And in particular, though, I grew up hearing stories of sports, less so much playing a lot of sports with my uncles who both lived in different cities, with my grandfather who played a little bit when he was older, but they used to tell lots of stories. There were always lots of stories of sports, and in particular stories of my uncles and my grandfather, my Zeta, and then later my dad joining them when he kind of was dating my mom and was married, and driving down in the middle of the night to Minneapolis, the old Metropolitan Stadium, seeing great teams in the 60s, you know, like Harmon Killebrew, Tony Oliva, Rod Carew. A little bit of a Jewish connection there, right? Rod Carew. Though I don't know if he actually ever converted, but he's in Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song, so that counts for something. And I would hear all these stories about these great teams. Of course, in 1965, the Twins went to the World Series and they faced the LA Dodgers. And the LA Dodgers had the best pitcher in baseball, this guy right here, Sandy Koufax, who was 100% Jewish. And in the 1965 World Series, Koufax became quite famous because he refused to pitch. I can't remember if it was game one or whatever, but he refused to pitch in the game of the World Series that fell that year on Yom Kippur. And growing up, I heard the story of Sandy Koufax not pitching on Yom Kippur, and it was, I don't want to overstate it, but as a young boy, I'm talking about me, sports wasn't like the Jewish world, it was the greater world. Hearing this story of Judaism, of religion and culture and ethnicity intersecting with sports and with popular sports and on the world stage, and this Jewish player making the statement that his Judaism meant more to him than baseball, it was huge. It was huge. It was like Mount Sinai huge. It may seem like an exaggeration, but when there just aren't a lot of times where a Jewish statement like that can be made by a very prominent celebrity on a secular stage. So it was huge. And so I grew up thinking, Sandy Koufax, wow, what a Jewish hero. But it's just not true. Wait, it is true that it was a huge statement, and he did something amazing, and it's been talked about ever since, and it has inspired other players to do similar things. But because I heard it first, and the way I always felt about it, it was like Sandy Koufax was the first player, the first Jewish person who had to make this choice between Judaism and career. And it's just not true. That's the injustice we are here to set out and correct. Because 31 years, 3 full decades before Sandy Koufax sat out on Yom Kippur, and by the way, without a lot of fanfare, without a lot of publicity, without a lot of pushback, maybe because he was a pitcher, he could just turn around and pitch the next day. He didn't have any of those things, but 31 years before him, the first guy who ever had to kind of cross this bridge, Sandy Koufax actually had an example he could follow. And I didn't know about this when I was a kid. I didn't know about this until somewhat recently. But it was Hank Greenberg who really was the first. And you know that expression, the first one through the door always gets bloodied? I grew up thinking Sandy Koufax was the first one through the door, but he wasn't. Hank Greenberg was the first one through the door. And that is the injustice we are here to correct and to have a little fun with also today. So no disrespect to Sandy Koufax. He's an amazing pitcher, shorter career, but a dominant career in the 1960s before his arm basically fell off his body. Anyone who's interested, the best piece of writing I have ever come across on Sandy Koufax that really captures his story as a player, but also as a bit of a reclusive personality. Because you see, Sandy Koufax was not a spotlight guy. That's, if you think you've never heard about Sandy Koufax in the last 50, 60 years since he finished playing baseball. He lives very much reclusively. He doesn't do a lot of interviews. He doesn't do a lot of press. He's not around the Dodgers. He just isn't. He's not around baseball. Not a lot. He likes to keep to himself. He's a very quiet guy. He's not like not much of a role model. Not a very outspoken or vocal kind of guy. The most interesting thing I've ever read about Sandy Koufax, if you want to do some reading, find an article from the Sports Illustrated from years, I don't know when, but maybe you can find the article called "The Left Arm of God" by great baseball writer Tom Verducci. Some of you have maybe heard of Tom Verducci. Write that down if you're interested. "The Left Arm of God." It's the most fantastic piece I've ever read up on Koufax. So Koufax is our jumping off point to get here and to correct the injustice, but we will not be talking about him. We will be talking about this guy, Hank Greenberg. Also known as Hammerin' Hank, also known as the Hebrew Hammer, an American professional baseball player and then later a team executive. A little quick intro. He played Major League Baseball, primarily for the Detroit Tigers, as a first baseman in the 1930s and the 1940s. He's a member of baseball's Hall of Fame. He was twice voted in his career the most valuable player, the MVP of the American League. He was one of the premier power hitters of his generation and also all time. He is widely considered still in the year 2020, over 80 years after his debut, to be one of the greatest sluggers, one of the greatest power hitters in baseball history. And for you kind of looser baseball fans, in baseball, if you hit lots of singles, you could be a great hitter, but it's only when you start hitting doubles and lots of home runs that you would be considered a power hitter. Hank Greenberg is one of the premier power hitters of all time. He was 4 times an All-Star. He had a batting average over 300, which is a mark of kind of, being good. If you get a hit about roughly every 3 out of 10 times. 8 times he was a batting average over 300. And he and the Detroit Tigers won 2 World Series championships. He led the American League in home runs 4 times. We'll talk more about the season in which he had his most home runs later. But that was in 1938 when he hit 58 home runs. Almost a record. And he, to this day, a little piece of trivia, still holds the American League record for most RBI, runs batted in a single season. In 1937, he had 183 RBI in 1937, and that is still the American League record to this day. Interesting. In 1947, when he signed his last baseball contract, it was for $85,000, which was a record at the time. And after retiring from playing baseball, he continued to work in baseball as a team executive and an owner. He was both a GM and a part owner of the Cleveland Indians. I mentioned there was a connection, and then later the Chicago White Sox. My fan is acting up a bit, so I'm going to put my headphones on here. Bear with me. Some of my bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah students say that when my computer fan starts acting up a little bit, that it can be distracting. So I've put in the headphones. So here's a few shots of Hank Greenberg, young and old. This is the guy we are talking about. Here's a nice shot. A nice shot, taking a nice swing there in action. I wonder where that one's going. Probably just a little pop-up. No, he probably hit that one out. And here are some of the stats, just to quickly run through it. Like I was telling you, he played almost 1,400 games. There are his runs and his hits, his home runs, his RBI, his runs batted in. For all you non-super baseball fans, RBI is when there are players out on the bases and you're batting, and you get a hit that allows those players to score because of your hit. That's considered a run batted in. So it's both a measure of, you have to have opportunities, right? Guys in the middle of the lineup usually come up more often with runners on base than guys at the top of the lineup, for example, just kind of traditionally. But you also have to be clutch. You also have to deliver. Twice the AL most valuable player, 4-time World All-Star, twice World Series, 4-time home run champ, and they're the home runs. So that's what we got so far. People are starting to weigh in a bit on the chat. Rod Carew converted. His in-laws were friends of my great aunt and great uncle, Louise says. That's great. Koufax pitched games 2, 5, and 7 in the 65 World Series, Steven says. Fanboy talks about, he may show up for training camp, but he's really not a public figure. That's Sandy Koufax. And a little bit more about interesting about Lou Gehrig. I got to check on that. Anyway, that's good. We'll go back to sharing the screen. Okay. Very good. Oh, whoops. No, I'm going to save that. I want to save that. We'll put this picture back on. So that's a little bit about Hank Greenberg, the ball player. But let me tell you about Hank Greenberg, the guy, as we stare at this photo. There you go. We can peer into his eyes. We can talk a little bit about Hank Greenberg, the guy. So, full name, Henry Benjamin Greenberg. Actually, he was born Hyman Greenberg. I don't know if he precipitated the changing of his name from Hyman to Henry, or if it was his parents having second thoughts, but I think they made the right call. Hyman is a tough first name. We were looking at H names, right? Our son is Hugo. And Hyman did not crack the top 30,000. It wasn't going to be Hyman. So yes, Henry Benjamin Greenberg, Hank. January 1st. He's a January 1st birthday. Isn't that interesting? All those theories about January and February birthdays, right? And earlier in the year becoming athletes and things like that. Well, it worked for Hank Greenberg. He was born January 1st, 1911 in Greenwich Village, New York. He grew up in the Bronx. His family moved to the Bronx, I think, when he was about 7. He was one of 4. He had an older brother, an older sister, and a younger brother. And his parents were immigrants. They were both from Romania. His father, David Greenberg, his mother, Sarah Greenberg, they together owned a successful cloth shrinking plant in New York. I haven't done any more research to find out what a cloth shrinking plant was all about, but that was the business they were in. And the family moved up to the Bronx, which is a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, where Hank grew up. Like I said, he was about 7 years old. They spoke Yiddish in the home. They attended shul regularly. Hank most certainly had a bar mitzvah, as I'm sure his other two brothers did as well. He went to a high school in the Bronx called James Monroe High School. He was an outstanding all-around athlete. He was great at soccer. He was great at basketball, but his preferred sport was baseball. The only problem was he was quite tall. Like by the time he was 18, he was already 6'3", 6'4", and he didn't move so great in the field. So he ended up settling on first base, which is probably the least demanding of all positions on the field defensively and for moving, right? First base, you don't move a ton. There's obviously tons of nuances to first base, and there have been great fielders who've played first base, but the demands are not like in the outfield, and certainly not like shortstop, third base, even second base or catcher. So quote unquote, it's the easiest position to play in the field. Like if you got a big, huge guy on your team and you want his bat in the lineup, where are you going to put him? First base. Who's on first? Hank Greenberg. So he played first base. And in 1929, at the age of 18, the New York Yankees came calling and offered Hank Greenberg a contract. But they had this guy at first base already named Lou Gehrig, who was very famous, and whom Stephen has pointed out. Actually, Stephen believes Lou Gehrig had 184 RBIs, and that it was only Hank Greenberg for the record by right-handed batters. I will check that. I'm not going to dispute Stephen. He's pretty good with this sort of thing. But the point is, Lou Gehrig, who is one of the greatest baseball players of all time, was playing first base for the Yankees, and Hank Greenberg said, "First base for you guys? I don't think I'm ever going to make it." So he turned down the contract offer, and he went instead to New York University, and he spent 1 year at NYU. And after that year at NYU, the Detroit Tigers came with an offer of a $9,000 contract. In today's terms, that would be $138,000. But in 1930, they came with a $9,000 offer, and Hank Greenberg signed. And he joined the Detroit Tigers. He played very briefly in that 1930 season, but then ended up going to the minors and spent 3 years in the minors before making his debut professionally in 1933. Just to give you a little idea about Greenberg and why it was all about baseball, right? His parents were immigrants. He was the son of immigrants. He very, very badly. There's been many biographies made about Hank Greenberg, a lot of interviews. We'll talk about some of them. And he was not, even though his family was very religious and very devoted to Judaism, Greenberg actually once said, and it's a quote, that he considered Judaism to be, quote, an accident of birth. He did not have some close connection to tradition or God or Judaism or anything like that. And I don't know if it was so much rebelling against it as much as he was the son of immigrants, and it was the American dream. He wanted desperately to get out of the Bronx, to get out of this Jewish neighborhood, to get into the wider world, to find success, to get money, to get acceptance into America, right? Not to stand out, not to be different, but to be American. And for him, baseball was the ticket. Baseball was the ticket out of the Bronx. Baseball was the ticket out of Judaism. Baseball was the ticket to assimilation, which is what he wanted. His parents called baseball players bums, and they were not thrilled with his decision, but nevertheless, they didn't disown him or anything. They continued to support him, and he left at 19 years old to go play minor league baseball in the Detroit Tigers system. 3 years in the minors, an MVP of the Texas League in 1932, and then he officially made his major league debut in 1933. In his rookie season with the Detroit Tigers, he hit .301 and drove in 87 runs. As a 22-year-old rookie. Really not a bad rookie season in 1933. Now, in those years in minor league baseball, Greenberg, you have to remember, this is like 15 years before Jackie Robinson became the first black player in baseball. There was never there had been other Jewish ball players before Hank Greenberg. He certainly wasn't the first, but he was the first of note. And there had been some famous Jewish boxers. So there were Jewish athletes around. But in his second year, when he quickly started rising through the ranks, as we'll talk about in just a second, and becoming a noteworthy star, a celebrity athlete, he was the first Jewish celebrity athlete, Hank Greenberg, really, in any kind of professional sport. In any, there were some other players and there were some boxers, but baseball, you have to remember also what baseball was in American consciousness at the time, the national pastime. This is before TV. This is before, like, baseball was, Babe Ruth was the biggest athlete, the biggest sports celebrity. And he was playing for the Yankees, and Lou Gehrig was huge. And so he does deserve to be credited. Hank Greenberg does deserve to be credited as the first Jewish superstar in, well, North American sports and I think probably world sports. So, but as he was making his way up through minor leagues, he used to hear a lot of anti-Semitic slurs when he was 1920, when he left for the first time. He said that he would routinely get called kike. He would routinely get called sheeny or maki. One of the things he used to hear, one of the lines that's kind of been circulated is, throw him a pork chop, he can't hit it. And here's a quote from Greenberg talking about the early years, and really it continued throughout his whole career. Every ballpark I went to, there'd be somebody in the stands who spent the whole afternoon calling me names. If you're having a good day, you don't give a damn. But if you're having a bad day, why, pretty soon it gets you hot under the collar. We go ahead here. This guy on the right, this is Bertie Tebbetts, a teammate of Hank Greenberg, who famously mentioned this, has had this quote: there was nobody in the history of the game who took more abuse than Greenberg, unless it was Jackie Robinson. Remember, though, this was before Jackie Robinson, so that we now know, we have the frame of reference, and we'll talk about that before the end of the talk here, because Greenberg and Jackie Robinson had an amazing encounter at the end of Greenberg's career / beginning of Robinson's career. But before Jackie Robinson, before any black athlete had the opportunity to even try, and then of course be just, have a barrage of hate pour down upon him every time he got anywhere close to baseball, Hank Greenberg was the first guy to be taunted, slurred, attacked, verbally attacked because of his ethnicity, because of his culture. And Bertie Tebbetts has this very famous quote: there was nobody in the history of the game who took more abuse than Greenberg, unless it was Jackie Robinson. Greenberg, in one of his biographies, mentioned that when he started playing professional ball, he realized that all of his teammates were, quote, country boys who had never seen a Jew. I remember my teammate, Jojo White, when he saw me, he couldn't understand because he was always told that Jews had horns. And here I was, I looked like a normal human being, and he just couldn't figure it out. Greenberg, at the beginning when he was young, his reaction was always, it was visceral, it was anger, it was horrible, but he learned very quickly that reacting with anger only encouraged more anti-Semitic slurs. They knew they were getting to him, so they would crank it up. So Hank Greenberg, at a very young age, remember, he's like in his early 20s. It's amazing. He learned to, in almost all situations, day after day, game after game, stoically just take it and kind of stew in silence. Really quite amazing and really quite mature. His quote was that these anti-Semitic slurs became a spur to make me do better because I could never fall asleep on the ball field. This guy on the left here is, he's a guy named Charles Coughlin, who was a Christian minister. And I bring him up because you need to know that Detroit in the 1930s, of all the places for the first Jewish baseball star, the first Jewish superstar to land, Detroit, it's very interesting that he ended up in Detroit. Because Detroit, you could make the argument in the 1930s, was the hotbed of American anti-Semitism. We all know what was going on in Europe. In 1933, the year that Hank Greenberg made his professional debut with the Tigers, was the same year that Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. And we know that the night of broken glass, Kristallnacht, was just 5 years later. So this is really the rise of Nazism and anti-Semitism in Europe. We know what was going on. But over here in North America, and particularly in Detroit, there were two characters, maybe America's two biggest anti-Semites, and they were both based in Detroit. The first was Henry Ford. We've heard of Henry Ford, the assembly line, cars. He was maybe the most famous person in Detroit in the 1930s, in all of Detroit. And he used a lot of his spare time to distribute anti-Semitic propaganda. Henry Ford owned a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, which went so far as to call Jews the world's foremost problem. And then there was this guy, Father Charles Coughlin, a Catholic priest who had a radio program that he used to spread anti-Semitic messages to his average listening audience of 30 million people every week. He had a show that 30 million people in the 1930s used to listen to, and this is one of his quotes. "We are Christian insofar as we believe in Christ's principle of love your neighbor as yourself, and with that principle I challenge every Jew in this nation to tell me that he does not believe in it." So Hank Greenberg was feeling anti-Semitism everywhere he went, and then in Detroit, of all places, we had these characters. So this brings us to 1934, Hank Greenberg's second season as a Major League Baseball player, and it's approaching the fall and the end of the baseball season, looking ahead to the playoffs. Playoffs were a little different back then, right? They didn't have as many teams make the playoffs. There weren't as many teams in the league. If you had the American League and the National League, and one team won the American League and one team won the National League based on the regular season, those teams won the pennant, right? They won the American League or the AL pennant, the National League or the NL pennant, and then those two teams who had not seen each other all year because the AL and the NL never played, those teams that played, they only played within their own leagues, the AL winner and the NL winner went on to play each other in the World Series. That was happening back in the day, in 1934. So the Tigers, who are one of the original franchises, right? They've been around since before the turn of the 20th century, like teams like the Boston Red Sox and the Pittsburgh Pirates, Chicago Cubs, Chicago White Sox. They hadn't won a pennant. They hadn't won the pennant, the American League pennant, since 1909. So it's been 25 years. So they're starved. They got a drought. Similar, I guess, to the Bombers, right? It's been 30 years since winning the Grey Cup in a smaller league, and the Tigers in a smaller league haven't been to the World Series in 25 years. And here are the Tigers in 1934 in first place, led by their new young superstar, Hank Greenberg, who is 23 years old, who has a batting average of .339, and he's really made a name for himself. He's really become quite famous. And here are the Tigers, 4 games ahead of the New York Yankees, who have Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, 4 games ahead of the Yankees, 20 games to go in the standings, 25-year drought since winning a pennant, and September 10th is coming up, and September 10th is Rosh Hashanah. And on the final road trip of the final road trip before Rosh Hashanah, the Tigers were down in Philadelphia, and Greenberg's parents drove down from New York to Philadelphia to see him and told him, with the high holidays coming up, they made him promise that he wouldn't play. September 10th, 1934, Rosh Hashanah. There's a game scheduled. Tigers hosting the Boston Red Sox. And like I said, 20 games left, the New York Yankees hot on their heels, and the Tigers have a 4-game lead. So Greenberg had floated the idea publicly that he may not play on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and this turned into a debate across the entire city. Even the Detroit Free Press got in on the action when they heard word that Greenberg may not play. You have to know he was, of course, torn between the fact that he's Jewish. Part of it was that he had made this promise to his parents, but he had this feeling, the sense of duty. And then, of course, what we know about the fact that he wasn't an observant Jew, a religious man, but he did know that there was tradition and a sense of duty in his parents, on the one hand. On the other side, reflected by this quote, "I was probably the only batter in the lineup that was not in a slump." He's their best player. He's 23 years old. He's their best player. They haven't made the World Series in 25 years. They have a legitimate chance. Every game counts. The Yankees are chasing them. He's a teammate. He wants to be in the good books of the people of Detroit. He's very conflicted. And I mentioned the Detroit Free Press got in on the action. This is the Detroit Free Press cover, maybe for sports, from the day before. So this is September 9th, 1934. This is the actual Detroit Free Press from the day before Rosh Hashanah, when the word was that Greenberg was toying with the idea of not playing. And in fact, in one of his maybe his most recent biography, the way it's described, they do a fantastic job of capturing. What's that book called? I've got it written down here. Hank Greenberg, The Hero of Heroes, by John Rosengren. The very first chapter, called Lashon HaToivo, really captures this whole struggle that we're touching on here, this Rosh Hashanah struggle. But anyway, so it's the day. So the point I was going to make is that even the day before Rosh Hashanah, Hank Greenberg wasn't sure what he was going to do. In fact, even on the day of, when he woke up in the morning, he still wasn't sure to do, because he actually went to shul in the morning on the 10th. We'll get to that in a second. But the day before, September 9th, this is the Free Press, Detroit Free Press cover. Can you see right up here? You see my cursor? Tigers' lead is cut to 4.5 games when they split with A's. Yankees continue to climb. Oh, the pressure is mounting. The Yankees are coming. Oh, no, not the Yankees. This part here, I've blown it up. Look at that. Hebrew letters. Front page sports section, Detroit Free Press, September 9th, 1934. Hebrew letters. Rosh Hashanah, Lashana Tova Tikatevu. And so to you, Mr. Greenberg, the Tiger fans say Lashana Tova Tikasevu. Yiddish, of course, which means Happy New Year. This is crazy. This is 1934 newspaper. Nowadays, they could do this no problem, but you have to understand, this was long before digital printing. So in order for the Free Press to make this happen with these 3 Hebrew words, they would have had to have gotten special metal plates just for these 3 words. But they did. That gives you an idea of how big a conversation point Hank Greenberg playing or not playing tomorrow was on September 9th, 1934 in Detroit. You have to think it was the single most talked about thing going on in Detroit in that moment. For them to do this, to run this in the newspaper. Jonathan Sarna, a professor of American Jewish history at Brandeis University, says this may be the only instance in history of a major American newspaper with a Hebrew headline. How crazy is that? They were trying to sway him. It's amazing. And when you think about what Detroit was in the 1930s, we talk about Father Charles Coughlin, and we talk about Henry Ford. Even more amazing that Greenberg was able to get this to happen. So anyway, fast forward, we go to the next day, December 10th, 1934. So it's September 10th, 1934. Greenberg wakes up and he goes to synagogue. Right? The game is not until in the afternoon. Remember, there were no night games back then. They didn't have lights in a lot of places, so they're going to play in the afternoon. But in the morning, he got up and he went to shul. He went to Detroit's oldest and largest conservative synagogue, which called Shaare Zedek. And when he went in, you can imagine everybody, like the whole place stopped. He talks about it in that biography. They actually offer him Hagbah when he walks in. The lifting of the Torah at the end of the Torah service, they offer him Hagbah, and he says, I'm only a player. I'm only a ball player. Give it to someone else who really deserves it. So truly humble. But he's also 23. Like, it's so hard. You have to wrap your mind around 23 years old. I'm 35. Our quartet maestro, Justin Odwak, is 26. This guy is 23. And he woke up on the morning of the game and he still didn't know what he was going to do. He was so conflicted. He was so torn. He went to shul. He figured, there's no game in the morning. I'll go to shul in the morning. He goes to shul. They offer him Hagbah. He says no. And he sits in shul for a couple of hours. And then as turns to the afternoon, because remember, 1934, the shul service probably went till 2:30 in the afternoon after starting, 8:30 for the whole day. He gets up and he leaves. But when he left, he went to the ballpark, he still didn't know if he was going to play. And in his biography, The Hero of Heroes, he's sitting there at his locker, kind of not moving for ages. And teammates aren't sure what he's going to do. And his manager, he asks him, his manager won't decide for him. You know, we could really use you, but it's your decision. Mickey Cochran, his manager. He really didn't know what he was going to do. And especially when he went to shul, he didn't know. When he left shul, he didn't know. But everybody was just fixated. And of course, they had, you know, people running around checking newspapers and check, because newspapers would come up multiple times during the day, or checking the radio. And that there's a story that during the afternoon, as the afternoon went on, the service, the cantor would take little pauses when he was singing, and he would stop and he would ask someone, "How's Hank doing?" When it finally came out that Hank Greenberg did in fact play, because he ultimately decides to play on Rosh Hashanah. But before I tell you about what happened, you see, the newspapers actually consulted rabbis. The Detroit News, this newspaper here is the Detroit Free Press, but the Detroit News reached out to a rabbi named Joseph Thumim, who was the head of Detroit's Temple Beth Abraham and an authority on Orthodox Jewish law. And they kind of took him out of context. They made it seem like he was giving Hank Greenberg permission, which he later denied. He just basically had said that he had found two sources in the Talmud that said it is allowed to play ball on a holiday in the street. And the newspaper was saying, "Look, even an Orthodox rabbi says he can play. Come on, Hank, play." And then later the rabbi was really pissed when it came out and said that he was taken out of context and he didn't like this at all. There was another rabbi that they contacted another rabbi, Dr. Leo Franklin, Temple Bethel, and his statement was, quote, "Mr. Greenberg, who is a conscientious Jew, must decide for himself whether he ought to play or not. From the standpoint of Orthodox Judaism, the fact that ball playing is his means of livelihood would argue against his participation in the game. On the other hand, it might be argued quite consistently that his taking part in the game would mean something not only to himself but to his fellow players, and in fact, at this time, the community of Detroit." So that rabbi kind of refuted the idea. It's like, he's not just going to play a game. This is his job. He's doing his job, but at the same time, you know, leaving it up to him, not saying one way or the other. So as I mentioned, Greenberg leaves the shul. He gets to the stadium. He still doesn't know what he's going to do. He finally decides he's going to play. The game's a nail-biter. The Tigers are trailing 1-0 to the Red Sox for most of the game. In the bottom of the seventh, Hank Greenberg hits a solo home run to tie the game 1-1. And then he leads off the bottom of the ninth. The Red Sox pitcher is a guy named Gordon Rhodes, and Hank Greenberg, to lead off the bottom of the ninth, hits another home run, another solo home run, walk-off home run, wins the game for the Tigers 2-1. In the Detroit News, the reporter Harry Salsinger described the game-winning home run like this: "Greenberg drove the ball on a line. It looked like a Bobby Jones tee shot. It was still rising when it neared the fence in left center just beyond the scoreboard. It cleared the fence with a few feet to spare and continued on its course, still rising. It was one of the most perfect hits we have ever seen delivered in baseball." In the Detroit Times, another sports reporter, Bud Shaver, wrote, "The traditional tenacity of the world's oldest and most beleaguered people today had played part in a pennant race, winning a ball game. There was more than the mighty bone and sinew of Hank Greenberg behind those two home runs. They were propelled by a force born of the desperation and pride of a young Jew who turned his back on the ancient ways of his race and creed to help his teammates." The biographer describes the game like this: "Greenberg's two Rosh Hashanah home runs became as celebrated as the stones flung from David's slingshot." While in front of his locker facing reporters after the game, all Greenberg said was, "The good Lord did not let me down." But to a teammate, Marv Owen, he later confided, "I hope I did the right thing. Maybe I shouldn't have played. It's a sacred day. There wasn't any way of getting a dispensation or anything. I got thinking about the team and I didn't want to lay down on the team, but it's on my conscience." To which Marv Owen, the teammate, responded, "I wish I had a couple of home runs on my conscience." Greenberg explained that when he got to his hotel room, the phone didn't stop ringing. He said, "I caught hell from my fellow parishioners. I caught hell from some rabbis, and I don't know what to do." Racked with guilt, he wrote a letter to his parents to explain what to do, what he had done, why he had done what he had done. And he claimed that his mom was more understanding than his dad. They got in touch with him, and his dad said, "You are absolutely not to play on Yom Kippur." This captures a little. There's another quote from Hank Greenberg about this conflict and the drama and this baseball versus Judaism. It's really amazing how it was captured in the writing by the reporters and really in the way Greenberg was feeling. I never knew any of that from Koufax. I never got the sense with Sandy Koufax that it was on this level, that newspapers were weighing in trying to sway him, that they were consulting rabbis, that everybody was talking about it. Suppose I stay out of the game and we lost the pennant by 1 game. That'll keep the boys out of the World Series after they've worked so hard all season. Would that be justice? What'll they think? What'll Detroit think? This is that quote I told you about that he said to Marv Owen, hoping he did the right thing. Iffy the Dopester, a writer in the Detroit Free Press, he weighed in. Told you that the writers are all getting. Here's one more quote. "I do not know anything about the law of the most ancient church in the world. That's all for students of the Talmud. But I'm here to testify in the world as a baseball expert that the 2 hits he made in that ball game were strictly kosher." I love it. And here's the paper from the next day. September 11th, 1934, the Tuesday. See it here? I blew it up. "A happy New Year for everybody." It's incredible. He didn't play on Yom Kippur, and the the Tigers lost 10 days later on Yom Kippur, prompting Edgar Guest to write this. Where did this appear? Why don't I have it? He wrote this in, I think it's also the Detroit Free Press. I'm just checking. Amazing that Edgar Guest would write this poem in the Detroit Free Press. So he played on Rosh Hashanah. He felt terrible about it. He felt really racked, like guilt, and then he didn't play on Yom Kippur, and they lost on Yom Kippur. And Detroit Free Press. And then because he sat out on Yom Kippur and then they lost, Edgar Guest wrote this poem, and this appeared in the Detroit Free Press. It's unbelievable just how the media got involved in this story. It's crazy to me. In 1934, came Yom Kippur, holy fast day worldwide over to the Jew, and Hank Greenberg, to his teaching and the old tradition true, spent the day among his people, and he didn't come to play. Said Murphy to Mulrooney, "We shall lose the game today. We shall miss him on the infield and shall miss him at the bat, but he's true to his religion, and I honor him for that." Mark Kurlansky, who was another biographer of Hank Greenberg, said that after that, so he played on Rosh Hashanah and it was all over the news, and then he didn't play on Yom Kippur. And not playing on Yom Kippur, this really captures, this is Kurlansky, a biographer, saying, after Yom Kippur, Greenberg came to be seen as a muscular 6'4" bulwark against anti-Semitism. Fans and reporters started to ignore the real Hank Greenberg in favor of this image of the mythic super Jew, the deeply religious man who also played baseball very well. Now, you have to know that Greenberg really resisted this when he was playing. He really didn't want to be known for being Jewish. He really felt torn between family, tradition, and loyalty to his team, loyalty to both sides. And when that got out, you see what the reporters and what the media have really done, right? Greenberg lost control of his own narrative, trying to do the right thing by himself, by his parents, by his city, by his team. Hard to satisfy everybody, impossible. And so he really resisted this. But Mark Kurlansky really takes us into that time that in the 1930s in Detroit, Hank Greenberg was more than just a baseball player, especially in the Jewish world. And maybe in the non-Jewish world too. He was the Jewish guy trying to make it in a secular world. A mythic super Jew. It didn't hurt that he was 6'4", that he was this huge muscular guy. But even still, he had no control over his narrative, and he was becoming this mythic super Jew. And we know he wasn't a deeply religious man. We know it wasn't true. But Greenberg, that was what was kind of foisted upon him. Wait, We'll get to that in a second. You should know that the Tigers did win the pennant in 1934, so they did go to the World Series. They lost the World Series in 7 games to St. Louis. But the next year, Greenberg had an even better year. He won the MVP, his first of 2 MVPs in 1935. The Tigers won the pennant again, and they won the World Series. And Greenberg just continued to soar and soar and soar. So in the end, the Rosh Hashanah decision probably helped. The Yom Kippur decision didn't hurt. They went to the World Series. They didn't win. The next year, he won the MVP. First Jewish MVP winner ever in baseball in 1935. And they went to the World Series. So Greenberg continues to have a couple. His career, he's an amazing player. Like I said, he's racking up all the titles. He's going to All-Star games. He's a huge slugger. He's a great hitter. 1938, a couple years later, 1938 is a very notable season. Here, I'll exit out of this for just a second. Say hello to everybody. And just mention that in 1938, Greenberg finished with his highest home run total. He ended up hitting 58 home runs in 1938. The record was 60, set a few years earlier by Babe Ruth. 1927, I think, Ruth, the murderer's row year, I think was when Ruth hit 60. And Babe Ruth, I got a picture of Babe Ruth. I'll go to him when I go back to the presentation. Babe Ruth has this record. You know, he's the best baseball player of all time at this moment. And Greenberg is on on pace to maybe break Babe Ruth's home run record. There are 2 things worth mentioning about this 1938 season. The first is that knowing what was going on in Europe, knowing what was happening at the time, led Hank Greenberg to offer a quote. Not at the time, but later, kind of in retrospect. I have the quote. I'll show you. Just a very powerful quote about kind of his mentality. It's hard to know if it was at the time or if it was later when more maturity allowed him to look back. But he definitely was kind of, whether he liked it or not, growing into this role as being a role model for Jewish folks. He has this quote about feeling like every time he hit a home run that year, he was hitting a home run against Hitler. I have the exact quote. I'll get that in a second. The other thing that happened, with 5 games left in 1938, he's 2 home runs away from Ruth's record, and he starts getting intentionally walked or intentionally walked. You know, like the pitches are missing, and it's almost like an unwritten conspiracy. And many people have speculated that pitchers stopped throwing anything that he'd be able to hit so that a Jewish guy wouldn't break Babe Ruth's record. Greenberg never said anything to the effect, but he finished the year with 58. He never got those last couple of home runs. He never was given the pitches to hit, maybe to tie Ruth or even break Ruth. Ruth's record of 60 stayed until 1961 when Roger Maris hit 1961. And then, of course, in 1998, McGuire hit 70 and Sosa hit 66, and steroids were around, and it was a little bit different. But that chase of the home run in the 90s, for anyone who remembers like I do when I was a teenager, was very, very exciting, gripped everybody. Same thing with Roger Maris in 1961. Roger Maris in 1961, a Yankee, a white guy, got tons of hate for breaking or for being on the verge of breaking Ruth's record. So you can only imagine what Hank Greenberg was probably facing. And this idea that pitchers were not pitching to him, is it that far-fetched? I don't think so. So 1938 is another important moment in the Hank Greenberg story. I'll show you that quote here. Here. I came to feel that if I, as a Jew, hit a home run, I was hitting one against Hitler. Again, it's unclear if he felt that at the time or if he felt that because he didn't say that at the time. I think he said that later. But you do get the sense that, you know, as he was getting older, into his later 20s and then up to 30, he was really starting to understand that he, rather than fight against this role as a Jewish role model, he was embracing it. Here's Babe Ruth. I guess he was a pretty good-looking guy. I think. I'm not entirely sure. George Herman Babe Ruth. So now we have a picture of Hank Greenberg in uniform. What's this all about? In May 1940, Hank Greenberg's career was interrupted when he was drafted into the Army. At that time, he was one of baseball's highest paid stars, and he gave up a salary of making $11,000 a month to making $21 a month. I share this because it's important in understanding Hank Greenberg's whole picture of his story, but it just really speaks to this idea of a guy who really, really embodied a sense of duty and loyalty to his family and to tradition, to his team, but also to his country. So in May 1940, he gets drafted into the Army. In August, though, a few months later, Congress decides that men over 28 years old do not need to serve. And Greenberg was 29, so he was honorably discharged. His plan was to return to the Tigers. Of course, the next year, 1941, in December, Pearl Harbor is bombed by the Japanese. The United States declare war. And even though Greenberg had been honorably discharged and did not need to go, he chose and he enlisted in the Army. He was offered a stateside job as an athletic instructor, but instead chose to go overseas. He served in the Army Air Corps in the China, Burma, India theater, and he had a distinguished record. He served in the Army for the rest of World War II. In the prime of his career, he gave it up. And again, he had been honorably discharged. He didn't have to do any of this. He may not have been able to play ball. Ball may have been a little bit different, but he didn't even have to. And when he did serve, he didn't even have to go overseas, and he still did. And I think that just knowing that, it's kind of like, to me, this sort of feels like he didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. He didn't just feel like that he was battling Hitler, and because he was, by being this Jewish figure who was fighting against hate, and maybe not directly, but indirectly or representatively for a lot of people, then he actually walked the walk. Then he actually chose when he didn't have to go into the Army. He actually went over and served. And he wasn't fighting in Europe, fine, but he was fighting against the Axis powers for the Allies. You would talk about being a mythic super Jew, like the hero of heroes. You can't leave this part of the story out. Like these decisions, these sorts of things. Like I could never see myself. I just can't see myself enlisting in the Army. I'd be too scared, I think. Every time I ever think about that, I just think about being too scared. And this guy, he just went for it. He's remarkable. He's a remarkable man. When the war ended in 1945, you want to talk about little moments that give you a mythical, like that, those 2 home runs on Rosh Hashanah. That's like the story of myth. And then going and fighting again, heroic, mythic. And then when the war ended in 1945, Greenberg was 34. He returns to the Tigers lineup in midsummer, and in his first game back, he hits a home run. His first game back, he hits a home run. And the last game of the season that year, 1945, he clinched the pennant for the Tigers with a grand slam. A home run with the bases loaded, a grand slam on the final day of the season. I believe he won his second MVP in 1945, and the Tigers won their second World Series in 1945. He played the next year, 1946, with the Tigers, and then he was released. And he played one more year in Major League Baseball in the National League with the Pittsburgh Pirates. As we mentioned, that final contract was $85,000, which was a record at the time. But Detroit let him go, and in 1947, he played. And there's Hank Greenberg on the left in his Pittsburgh cap and jersey. Now, the fellow on the right is Jackie Robinson, we talked about earlier. Jackie Robinson, 1947, it's a very interesting year, and it's fortuitous that Greenberg would end up in the National League for that one final year. He retired at the end of 1947. But how great that he got to play in 1947, and how great that he played in the NL, in the National League, because that was where Jackie Robinson, with the Brooklyn Dodgers, notice the B, not the LA Dodgers yet, not till 1958, the Brooklyn Dodgers became baseball's first black player. Now, there were rules against black players, right? And we talked about how, you'll see a quote in a second, but Greenberg and Jackie Robinson made his debut April 15th, 1947. It's Jackie Robinson Day in baseball. And Jackie Robinson, I'm sure you've all heard the name. Years before Rosa Parks, it was really an amazing moment. And the story, 42, about Jackie Robinson, based on his number, is a movie that you have to see. And Jackie Robinson is just such an amazing, just such a strong. You want to talk about heroes? He is truly, truly amazing. And I think in light of everything in the last several weeks, his story continues to shine brightly as an inspiration, especially for someone like me, who loves sports so much, and just that confluence of sports and of popular culture and kind of the real world, whatever you want to call it, culture, race, ethnicity. They met on the field, Greenberg and Robinson did, on May 15th, 1947. The Pirates played the Dodgers. According to sports reporter Ira Burkow, quote, Greenberg was appalled by some of the things the players in his own dugout were hollering at Robinson. There was a little drama that unfolded during that game when Jackie Robinson, batting, hit a ball and collided with Greenberg while he was running to first base. Greenberg went out of his way to help Robinson up, and he could be seen giving Robinson a pep talk. After the game, reporters asked Robinson what Hank Greenberg had said to him, and Robinson said, "He gave me encouragement. Mr. Greenberg is class. It stands out all over him." Hank Greenberg's son, Stephen, recalled years later that his dad, Hank, had said to him, he didn't know what having it bad was until he saw what Jackie Robinson went through. Which I think is a very important quote too, because it talks about, for everything that Hank went through, every game, always somebody in the stands. There was, I didn't mention it, but in the 1935 World Series against the Chicago Cubs, there was Greenberg was being taunted, Jew this and Jew that, and the commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, ended up fining a bunch of the players on the Cubs and the umpire, kind of in a reaction to hate speech almost in 1935. But for Greenberg to say that I didn't know what having it bad was until I saw what Jackie Robinson went through was really amazing. But if there was anyone on the field who could give Jackie Robinson any kind of advice, and it would be coming from a person who's like, I kind of know a little about what you're going through, or sort of, right? Like, I think that Jackie Robinson's volume of hate mail and things shouted at him, I think Greenberg's probably does pale in comparison. But if there ever was somebody who Robinson would have known could impart some wisdom or some advice or anything like that, I think that it's true. He probably did give him some encouragement. I just think that it's a really special moment. And again, very fortuitous that Greenberg would end up in the National League for one more year and have this opportunity to overlap with Jackie Robinson and have a meeting on the field. For a long time when I was preparing this talk, I kept wanting to call Hank Greenberg the Jewish Jackie Robinson, and I always kept feeling very badly about that because, again, I think Jackie Robinson went through so much more. But I only did that because I like the comparisons of Hank Greenberg being a role model, being the first one through the wall, like we talked about before, and getting bloodied, and being and really kind of growing up and embracing this role, this ability to be a role model. So that's just a really important story here at the end. We're just getting towards the end here. We're finishing up. This is the quote we'll get to in a second. After baseball, so he retires after the 1947 season, but it doesn't end there. Greenberg became an executive in baseball. He was a part owner and general manager of the Cleveland Indians for about 8 seasons in the 50s. He is really responsible for putting together the 1954 Cleveland team that won 111 games, a very, very good team. So he was involved with that. And of course, Cleveland was making some history. I don't think that Greenberg had so much to do with it. I think he got there a few years later. But the first black player in the American League was Larry Doby, and he played in Cleveland. So there's a nice connection there. And then after that, with a partner named Bill Veeck, Hank Greenberg purchased the Chicago White Sox in 1959, and he was a owner of the White Sox. So not only, and in that year, the White Sox won their first pennant in 40 years. In 1961, he sold his interest in the White Sox, and he ended up having a very successful career on Wall Street. In 1956, I believe it was, Hank Greenberg was elected to the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, and I'll show you his plaque in just a second. So he really was a pioneer as a player, as a builder. So for Sandy Koufax, who came 30 years later, for a general manager like Al Rosen, Hank Greenberg was a Jewish general manager in baseball. And for an owner like Bud Selig, who later became baseball's commissioner, could also look to Hank Greenberg as a trailblazer. It's a really unbelievable career, both on and off the field in baseball. Later on, when he would reflect, Hank Greenberg said this: "When I was playing, I used to resent being singled out as a Jewish ball player. I told you all that. I wanted to be known as a great ball player, period. I'm not sure why or when I changed, because I'm still not a particularly religious person. Lately, though, I find myself wanting to be remembered not only as a great ball player, but even more as a great Jewish ball player." So he changed. He grew into that role. I think he learned that he couldn't fight it and that he could do a lot of good. And he did. And his quote actually doesn't end there. It continues. "I realize now, more than I used to, how important a part I played in the lives of a generation of Jewish kids who grew up in the 30s. There's his plaque from Cooperstown. I've seen it myself. It's very cool. I've been to Cooperstown twice. Any baseball fan who hasn't been, you have to go. It has to be on your bucket list. It is. I haven't been to the other halls of fame, but I know enough from everyone who's told me that it is by far the best hall of fame. Even like people who love football more or whatever, like the room with the plaques and the whole museum leading up to it, just unbelievable." But here's his plaque. There you see it. One of baseball's greatest right-handed batters. There's the 58 in 1938. Talk about the RBI, the home runs. That grand slam for the 1945 pennant gets mentioned. 4 World Series. Most valuable player twice. Oh yeah, so it was 1940. It was before it was when he was drafted, but it was not 1945. My bad. And a lifetime average of 313, which is actually very high for a power hitter. Power hitters usually have a lower average. I wanted to share you a few final thoughts. There's 2 questions I kind of have about Hank Greenberg. I'm always interested how people feel. Do you think he did the right thing in 1934? What would you have done? Would you have played on Rosh Hashanah? Would you have not played? Would you have played on Yom Kippur? Would you have not played? I find this to be such an interesting question because it's a dilemma that still resonates all these years later, almost 90 years later. I see a lot of university students, first year in university, second year in university, choose university over Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. And I see kids, they say to me, they're worried about falling behind. They feel a lot of pressure. And I don't really get too involved in these kinds of conversations, but I know they happen. And I'm always curious what parents are saying. For me, I went to a Jewish school all the way until the end of grade 12, so I never had a conflict there like kids who go to public school. But I do know, for me, when I was in university, and of course part of it too is that I started working at the shul when I was 19, so it was always also a job. So I never really had a situation where I was, go to shul or go to school, right? Just straight like that. But but I can tell you that I had exams. I got up in faces with teachers. I had exams moved when teachers would schedule exams, like midterms that conflicted with not just Yom Kippur, but Simchat Torah. I always had those sorts of things. I got into a fight once with a teacher for scheduling an exam on a Friday night. Now, at the time, I wasn't Shabbat observant, but I just thought it was in such bad taste and bad form. And I ended up having to take that fight to the Faculty of Arts, and I got to write the exam earlier in the day. They were mad at me because I hadn't brought it up when the class started. I had waited till closer to the exam, which understood their point, but they still lost that fight. They didn't want to do that. And then and then when I was on the radio, the most interesting thing for me when I was on the radio, was Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur always fell during fall ratings. In radio world, March, April, September, October are the ratings periods, and you're not allowed to take any holiday, you're not allowed to take any time off. It's just like very stressful, right? This whole ratings world. And they knew I had the job, but I wouldn't have worked on the radio on those days. And I just think that the Hank Greenberg story is, I just wonder if a story like that would ever, how young people would feel about that, because I do really think that this is that's a century later and it's still something that I think resonates with young people is how do you reconcile loyalty to family and tradition and loyalty to your job or your team or your or whatever. So I find that to be very interesting. That dilemma. I think that dilemma from 1934 to 2020 is. I'm laughing because I like Stephen's point. I would have played on Rosh Hashanah only because we attend the first service. So Stephen, you would have gone to shul in the morning and then you would have played in the evening. I don't know if that's really the point. You're trying to have the best of both worlds. Please everybody. Interesting. Just before the final quotes I'll give you, Yerach asked, what is the logo on your shirt? I put on, my team is the Twins. I mentioned at the beginning, I grew up on stories before the Blue Jays were a team of my uncles and my dad and my Zeta driving in the middle of the night down to see some of the great Twins teams in the 60s. First baseball game I ever saw was at the Metrodome in 1993 or 94 against the Texas Rangers. And so I figured for this, I didn't want to put on a collared shirt, so I put on my Twins logo. Last thing, the other thing to think of is I'm always curious by this idea of athletes as role models. You know, Charles Barkley, famous basketball player, said that he didn't sign up for being a role model. And I wonder if athletes are allowed to have that choice. If you're a top athlete, are you a role model whether you like it or not? And you should, more like Hank Greenberg kind of evolved and grew into it and accepted it. Is that just what athletes and celebrities of that nature have to accept? That you are in the spotlight. And especially when a group, a cultural group or an ethnic group, they latch onto you. You know, I think from what I still follow a lot of sports news, and I think a lot of black athletes right now in the States, a lot of them are saying that you can't just be silent, that you have to speak out and you have to talk about the fact that you are a visible spokesperson, that people will listen to you, you know. Michael Jordan had this documentary about him that aired called The Last Dance, which is amazing. And he got a lot of flack for not backing a black politician in a race against a guy named Jesse Helms, who was just a horrible racist congressman. And Michael Jordan donated to the campaign, but he didn't say anything publicly. And some people defended his right to do that. And some people felt that he should do it. It's just it's an ongoing, much like what would you do in Hank Greenberg's situation, even in 2020, how do you feel about athletes as role models? I tend to lean to the way that that you should have known when you signed up. You know, when I decided to become a rabbi, one of the things that made a lot of that I thought about leading up to it before I made the decision, one of the big was knowing what that means beyond the job. And I think when you're a baseball player, you may know you have a lot of talent. You may not know you're going to be one of the best hitters, one of the best baseball players, but I think you have to know what you are signing up for. And I think I kind of lean towards, if you are really that great, you are going to be a role model, and you can do good with that. You can use that for good. I'm torn because I feel like people who don't want to be political and aren't comfortable talking politics shouldn't talk politics. So I feel conflicted about this too, but I wonder how you feel about that as well. I do want to tell you just a couple last quick things. The Yom Kippur quandary that Hank Greenberg went through, to play or not to play, and of course he didn't play, also affected the Supreme Court of the United States. Ruth Bader Ginsburg explained that Greenberg's conscience not to play in 1934 impacted on the Supreme Court's decision not to hold oral arguments on Yom Kippur. The court decided to spare Jewish lawyers this annual potential conflict. I believe that's still in effect to this day. Greenberg's story number 2 of 3, is a legacy not just for Jewish Americans, but other ethnic groups trying to balance faith and ethnicity with being a part of America. Newer ethnic groups and religious groups have noted Greenberg's example, including Fuad Zaban. In an article from 6 years ago in 2014, Fuad Zaban was quoted. He was the coach at Fordson High School in Dearborn. His Muslim players fasted when football season overlapped with Ramadan, and they drew inspiration, they said, from Greenberg. And how about this final quote from Scott Kaufman, CEO of the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Detroit. Hank Greenberg was one of the first Jewish role models out of Detroit. Not playing on Yom Kippur was a big statement to the community that you could have your identity and yet be part of the American culture at a time when many were immigrants or children of immigrants. He undid a lot of stereotypes at the time. So there you have it. Sorry we went a little long here. Thanks for spending this time with me, and hopefully you learned a little bit about Hank Greenberg. If you want to know anything more, Stephen Cantor is a bit of a whiz here on some of the trivia, some of the finer points that I may have glossed over or missed. So you can always ask me, or you can always ask Stephen. And I agree with Yerach, who just says that Greenberg is an American success story. But that really captures it, you know. It is something that I think we can all relate to, and that we all at some point will have to struggle with, because it doesn't always, you can't always do both. And sometimes you are torn between being Jewish and fitting in. I think in America, there's a different mentality from Canada. They always told me growing up, you know, in Canada, you're Jewish Canadians. In the States, you're an American Jew. And it was the idea of the melting pot in the States versus multiculturalism in Canada. I always felt like that was a little too easy, though it's obviously based on truth. But I do think that this is something that we can all, I know that I've shared some of the stories from my life, being on the radio and everything like that, and being in school. And I know that I see it with kids, with former students of mine, with young people. And I think it is a big deal, because I think how you feel about your Judaism is what you're going to pass on to your kids and what you're going to pass on to future generations. And that's why I think the Hank Greenberg story is important. I felt like it was kind of forgotten. I felt like it's overshadowed by Koufax, and I wanted to rectify that here. So please share this. If you know anyone who missed the talk, it will be available to watch later on YouTube on our Shared Zedek channel. If you aren't signed up for emails, make sure you do that. So you can be on our email list, and you can get all of the great content that we're putting out, myself and my colleagues, Rabbi and Leibl, and Dr. Rena. We're all putting out videos all the time. We're working on special projects and new things as we continue to kind of make our way through this pandemic. We're still in a pandemic, and we are hopefully getting closer to opening things up. But for now, we are really honored that you invite us into your homes or your work or wherever you are, so that we can continue to interact in spite of some of the limitations we have. So thank you again, everybody. I really appreciate you spending this time with me and bringing your own lunch and learning a little bit. You can email me, rabbimatthew@szedwinnipeg.ca. For those of you who have other ways of getting in touch with me, you can do that too. And I'd love to hear your feedback on this, and I look forward to doing something with all of you somewhere again down the road. Things will get a little quieter over the summer, but Rabbi Mas and Dr. Rena and I are working on something very special for Tisha B'Av, which is really kind of our only really major moment over the summer. We're working on an interactive rabbis panel with rabbis from across the city, and Rabbi Leibl and I are working on an interactive reading of the Megillah Echa with some of our top Torah and Haftarah readers. So that will be at the end of July, the 29th, I think. So stay tuned and watch for that, as well as updates over the summer about what we're trying to do with maybe reopening the synagogue. We'll see what we can do with all that. In the meantime, all of our services are streamed online. Make sure you check us out on Facebook or YouTube or our website, szedwinnipeg.ca. So thank you. And if you, I think baseball, there's going to be baseball this year too. I think that the commissioner is forcing that. So we'll have a little bit of that as well. So again, thanks everybody. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a little bit. And Wednesday, July 29th for Tisha B'Av. Thanks, Rena. Okay, thank you everyone. I don't know. Bonnie says that was fine. Like fine or fine. Either way, thank you for spending the time with me. Bye all. Stay safe, stay well, make good choices, and stay in touch. Thank you for spending this time with me, and take care. Oh, that was